Hello everybody, this is Fun Police, and we are back with another deck tech. This time we are taking a look at a US deck that notably is running a Polish ally. So this is our first Polish deck tech of the new expansion. I've been playing a lot of Poland recently, and it's definitely proven to be quite the powerful ally nation, which I'm very glad to see. Like they seem to be coming out strong and fitting into a lot of different decks. For today, we're taking a look at a more aggressive list, which is not something you would expect based on the cards revealed from Poland, but this deck I have found to be very fun, and due to a theme that Poland got, actually works together quite well. The theme from Poland that we're talking about is the Survive Combat effect. The Survive Combat effect largely just means that when it fights another unit, it gains an effect. And we're building a deck that is aggressive and is able to abuse that to create overwhelming advantages. This is, I would say, somewhat of this is definitely a very aggressive deck, but also has a lot of resiliency in the late game thanks to some cards we're going to talk about in a minute. Probably, I guess it is an in-between of a mid-range deck and an aggro deck. If you watched the last video about combined arms, I would say that deck was firmly mid-range, and I'd say this deck has overall ended up a bit faster than that. It can definitely drag the game out if it gets if it can draw its late game, which it's reasonable that it can. But it definitely also is very willing to just say, I'm going to kill you on like turn 4 or 5 if you don't deal with me. Besides that, I guess I gotta give one extra warning. Like last time, these decks are still early into the meta, even though we're starting to see a sort of meta form. It's been about a week or so since Legions dropped. It's still a lot in the air, and there are definitely just a lot of things that may end up changing, and so far this deck has seemed done relatively well against a handful of decks, but there's also some particularly tough matchups I've found. And it can be, for example, artillery, like the Soviet artillery decks. If they can get going, this deck can have a really hard time against them, as we just don't have a lot of ways to deal with them outside of just having a stronger board. And as such, it is important to just be aware that if you're seeing a lot of that deck, I would probably not play this. So just be hesitant about crafting any of these deck techs. I have had a lot of fun with these, but I can't promise they're good, and I don't want you to waste any of your any of your special or elite wild cards on this, only to realize it's not very good. So just be careful. Make substitutions if you can. And beyond that, let's just take a look at the deck itself. So starting off is a card that, in my review, I didn't give a lot of merit to, but has, I think, found a nice home in this deck. Stubborn Defense. You're able to give any unit that gets attacked +2 defense, and it doesn't seem like a lot, but this is actually a really nice combat trick. The fact that it's free is the big thing, because you're able to like force the enemy into trades that they actually might not have taken if they knew Stubborn Defense was up. And it's actually, obviously, it works very well with the Survive Combat cards, by often allowing them to survive a fight that they otherwise wouldn't, and then you get their effect off. But even just for other units, just being able to like protect some other unit, can help you like secure the front line for a longer time. And I think overall, it's just a very nice little card. We don't want to run too many copies though. It's low impact, but I found that 2 copies is about where I wanted. Then we have the 32nd Infantry Regiment. This is just like one of like the gold standard US 1-drops. It's a 2/1 infantry, so it's not that strong, but it's drawing itself. It just helps us to flood the board, get US units on the board. It can help get the front line. It can fight against aggro. It just does a lot in the early game. Very nice little card. Not much to say. Then we have the 109th Combat Engineers, and this is a very nice card. This deck has a lot of, almost every unit that you play is going to be moving into the front line. So the 109th is able to just buff their attack and make them just that bigger of a threat. It can help them fight better, it can also just allow them to better pressure the enemy, and it's overall just a very solid one-drop. We see this a lot in a lot of US aggro decks for good reason. And this is just another deck that, you know, benefits from all their units having like +1 attack if they get into the front line. Then we move on to the 5th Legions Regiment. The 5th Legions Regiment is, I think, an incredible one-drop. Having played around with it, this card is really insane. This is essentially a 1/3 with heavy armor 1 that slowly grows in attack. This guy is really hard to trade into and just overall very difficult for the enemy to deal with outside of order-based removal. He is the primary card I find if I'm facing off against Soviet artillery, as their one-attack artillery pieces aren't able to actually damage him, and instead just grow his attack. Same thing with low-attack bombers, or really anything that has one attack. And it's very easy that if a couple buffs on him and he gets out of control super quickly. And it's all from a little one-drop. That's the nice thing. This guy is just, he has performed amazingly well in the deck, just being like just a very solid card. He just does a lot for a one-drop, and I've been very happy with him. So 4 copies of that. Then we have the 99th Infantry Battalion. This is just like a standard like aggro card for most aggressive decks that are playing with the US. It's a vanilla base, it's a baseline infantry that if you control the front line, bounces an enemy unit, and that's very useful. For example, something like the US, you know, like a guard, it can cheaply get rid of guards or bombers or something that you can't deal with in the short meantime, and it's a very good tempo tool, just high tempo. And this deck is already looking to always have control of the front line, so this condition practically doesn't matter. Just a really solid card. Speaking of solid cards, the 507th PIR. This card looked insane during the preview, and then I saw a lot of people playing it and then saying it's actually not that good. I don't know what they're saying, though. This card is so good, it's not even funny. Like, on curve, the 507th is so insane. You just play it out, and it, like, buffs up your 5th Legions, or, like, anytime you play it, it just is insane. You know, you play it down on its own, it's a 4/3 smokescreen for 2 credits. That's really strong. You know, or you play, like, 5th Legions, and then into that, and your 5th Legions is a 3/3. You know, quite a big threat, and you still have to deal with the 507th. It has been really, really solid, you know. And if the enemy can't deal with it, it can absolutely snowball just out of control, you know, making all of your units significantly more threatening. So 507th has just done really well for me. I think it's just like I would say it's a staple of most US-based aggro decks. Then we have the 17th Infantry Regiment, and I need to take a minute to explain. So, I originally started building this deck with cheap orders in mind. Stuff like the US ACE or something like Supply Shipment were my go-to cards. But, currently the meta is not the most friendly towards straight-out buffs. And the big reason for that is a mixture of hard removal, for example, from Italy with Lion for a day, and also things like Confusion. And it overall just was, I found, a little too difficult. I think Supply Shipment could find room in the deck, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But that is why I went to the 17th, because I found that you only really need a tiny buff on a unit in order to make it, like, worthwhile. You know, like, giving the 7 TP or the 5th Legions +1/+1 means they could often trade and survive, and oftentimes kill whatever they were going to fight. You know, and then you're still also left with a 2/2 infantry that is US, which will be important, you know, but it can take the front line for like 99th, or cards we'll talk about in a second. And I found overall that, at least right now, this was actually one of the best buff options. So, I think that is at least at the moment. If we see a shift in the meta, I could absolutely see cutting these guys, or maybe if the meta stays like this, maybe there's even reason to run an extra 2 of them and just run all 4 copies. But I've settled on 2 for right now. But granted, again, the lists are always changing, so, you know, feel free to experiment. Then we got the 7TP, and 7TP has just been performing very well. It fights and survives. You know, if you play it on turn 2, most enemies I found are going to laser focus and spend their entire turn dealing with it, which is really nice. Like, the enemies I find over focus on this, or they try to ignore it by just playing big units, and then you're able to like buff it up and trade and draw that card. And really, this guy only needs to draw 1 card in order to be worth it. You know, like, we don't need to really like commit full time into the 7TP. We just play it once, you know, it's a decent 2-drop, and then, you know, it trades in, draws us a card, it's done its job. Just a very nice, solid 2-drop to put on the board. Then we got island hopping. I saw some people... Island hopping, in general, has just been overperforming for me, and I think it's one of the best cards in the deck. Especially since this deck is able to go late. Island hopping has just been an amazing force amplifier, able to just trade up in boards just constantly. We have a variety of blitz units or just big units that in one attack can activate island hopping, and even just getting it to activate 1 or 2 times, which I don't think is unreasonable, has proven to be very strong, as you're already kind of swarming the board in a way, and just having one of your units just get also really big is just really hard for the enemy to deal with. I've had games where various units will just be like attacking the HQ, and then one of them just gets buffed, and then the enemy tries to carp it, and then suddenly they have like 2 buffed up units that they can't deal with, and it's just snowballed out of control. I think island hopping is actually a really good card for US aggro decks, or at least mid-range decks. It's performed very well for me and has just put a lot of work in. Then we have the M16 HALF-TRACK. This is an important card for the deck because it's our best way to deal with guards and also air units, which are things we struggle with. The body itself is not particularly strong, but really we're just looking at ways to, alongside the 99th, the M16 is our best option at dealing with enemy guards, which is something that the deck can struggle with. If you don't have these, you know, sometimes we're forced to trade in when we're trying to build a board, but this can stall into like one of our board buffs or just give us the opportunity to hit the enemy HQ a little bit more. It has been a very useful tech card. Then we have the M18 HELLCAT. This is just a really good card. It's a very cheap form of blitz, so it offers extra burst damage, and it's also a good pressure unit. It also is able to deal with like really big tanks if that's an issue. And there's been a couple occasions I've found that the M18 can trade into like some big buffed tank or something and kill it off, and you know, that's all nice. But really, this is mostly going to be smacking the enemy's face for 4 damage. In the mid to late game, which is a totally fine proposition. You know, it's very nice burst damage, which the deck can benefit a lot from to help close out games. Then we have the PBY Catalina. This was a late addition, but has so far performed very well. Being able to just play down, like, this deck is all about really building a strong front line, and the Catalina, if you control the front line, the Catalina can be very hard to interact with, and that draw power that it has is amazing for the deck. Able to dig us so deep into our deck, we can very effectively just use it. Notably, there's a fun little interaction with the Catalina, where if you have multiple 30 seconds in hand, you can put one of them on top of your deck from the Catalina, and then play the other 30-second and draw that one. Essentially meaning you don't lose any cards to the effect. Just a nice little interaction, but overall, you know, you're drawing 2 cards a turn, and then being able to you're able to draw 3, and then you have to get rid of 1 and put it there for next turn. But the Catalina has just been a very nice draw. It's also a bomber, so we're able to like get around guards, and it can help activate like island hopping or help kill the enemy or snipe off like annoying artillery, and it's just been a very solid card so far. very well rounded in this deck. Then we have the M4A1, and this is just like one of those like stock standard US cards that so many decks play, and good reason for it. Can't be targeted by enemy orders is really good. It's well statted, and it has that discard tech, which discard is not the most popular deck at the moment, so we don't see that effect a lot, but really a 4/5 that can't be targeted by orders is a good unit. This card has done a lot for me in helping to lock down the front line. You know, if island hopping gets going on it, it can just turn into an unbeatable monster. Also, just any buffs on it in general are just really annoying. It's just a really good 4-drop. Then we move on to the other Sherman, which is just the M4 Sherman, and that is, if we control the front line, we draw 2 cards. This is probably our main draw engine of the deck. We're going to often have a lot of units in the front line, and the M4 Sherman just rewards us for that by helping us to put another unit out while filling our hand with more cards. In the mid game, this is the main thing we're going to be looking to activate in order to draw a lot of cards and keep going. And that is one of the best additions, and it just really helps the deck smooth out its mid game. However, I do want to note, you shouldn't aim to activate this on turn 4 if it's not convenient for you. It's entirely fine to wait a turn or two on the Sherman. You don't need to play it on turn 4. And if you have a stronger play, such as something like the M4A1 or the Catalina, absolutely do that first. Because this deck wants to build a strong board, you know, and then once we have the strong board, the Sherman, that's where the Sherman comes in. Don't try to force the Sherman by taking bad options and not playing like optimally, because that can really hurt us in the late game. Then we have the ZAZA Division. The ZAZA Division has been very nice as a nice just I'm going to kill you threat. That Fury and Blitz means it actually applies a lot of pressure alongside any sort of buffs. Again, island hopping works really well, but the 17th also works well with this. And obviously, it's also buffing all our other units, so in the late game, we're able to trade down the enemy board, and the Zaza's buffing all of them with more attack, turning them into bigger threats. And it's just been a nice card. I've actually found it, though, to actually be overall a better threat on its own rather than as a buff. So I actually prefer to play this on like turn 5 and blitz it into the front line, as that allows me to pressure the enemy HQ or whatever I'm going to attack into. But it's been a very solid card so far. Then we have We Can Do It. And this is our anti board clear tech. We're able, if we can build a decent board of 3 to 4 units, We Can Do It can just make it so hard for the enemy to deal with it. We don't even need big units. Obviously, we have some really big units like Shermans and the Zazas and the M4A1s, but even just stuff like the 507th or like the Legion in 7TP, or even just like a couple 30-second, you know, turn into like 2/4s and bigger and just survive carpet bombing in particular, which is definitely an excellent card. It also is a bit of healing for our HQ, which is actually really nice. And it draws and it replaces itself with draw. So this is just a really nice card, and is one of the big cards we're kind of building towards, because once we have a strong board position, We Can Do It can lock the game out. You know, how do you deal with like a 4/8 M4A1 alongside everything else being buffed? You know, so that's the strength of the We Can Do It, is that it turns our boards from threatening into there's no way you can deal with this. And it's a very crucial card. If you're playing against Britain, try to have this going into turn 7 and try to play it on whatever board you want to protect, because it will instantly negate the a single carpet bombing, which can really hurt the British player, because British players often really rely on carpet in order to come back from our pressure, and We Can Do It just negates that. Then we have the 101st Airborne. This has just been a really solid card. The deal 2 damage is very useful, either to help finish the enemy HQ off, snipe off some weakened unit. It has its own blitz, so it's able to immediately move into the front line, and that ambush can be sneakily annoying against some decks that are trying to fight into the front line themselves. Alongside like stuff like We Can Do It and other buffs, the 101st can just be really annoying to deal with, and overall is just a very nice, well-rounded 5-drop. And then the last card in the deck is our Strategic Bombing. This is just a really good card. It's a board clear for the support line, which is useful. It hits the enemy, and it hits the enemy HQ. It's able to get rid of like annoying bombers and artillery pieces, help finish off guards, add some extra damage. It just does a lot of stuff we want, and Strategic Bombing is just a very solid card within the deck. And that is the deck. So let's talk about our mulligan. So in general, when I mulligan, I'm looking for my 1-drops of the 32nd and the 5th Legions, followed up by a 2-drop. And then oftentimes I'm looking for a high tempo option, or stuff like the 17th, Stubborn Defense, and the 109th. We want to get our buffs going quickly. But really the most important thing is, for the most part, try to find your 1 and 2 drops. 32nd in particular is really good to have in an opening hand because it helps you smooth out any rough turns. You know, for example, if you don't happen to draw 2-drop, just play 2 32nd infantry, and that's a good turn too. As I said before, don't always try to force Sherman on 4. It's okay to wait to turn 5 or 6 in order to play the Sherman. Just make sure you're not risking it. Like, sometimes it's definitely kind of a case-by-case scenario, but, you know, like, if you feel like you're in a strong position, you don't need to force the Sherman out. You can take your turn to have more options to do various things rather than playing a kind of low-tempo turn. But if you feel like you might not control the board in a turn or two, it might be best to jam the Sherman to put out a decent body and then also make sure it's effect triggers, because it is quite bad if you don't get the effect off. So that's kind of important to not mess around with. Beyond that, once you get into the mid-game, Island Hopping is a really good card. If you have a turn of setup, the Island Hopping can be so good. But otherwise, you're looking for like half-tracks to bounce guards. You're looking for the draw, like I said. And then you're looking to probably try to get off a We Can Do It. For We Can Do It, it's important to not hold it back for too long. Even if you just have 2 to 3 small units on the board, it can be worthwhile to We Can Do It, just to make it so the enemy isn't able to push you off the board too easily. You know, even again, like on stuff like the 32nd or like the 5th Legions or like this, even the 17th Infantry Regiment. You know, a 2-5 or a 2-4 may not seem that strong, but it's very useful to contest the front line for stuff like the Sherman. You know, and just give you that time to maybe find your high impact cards and build up a board. Beyond that, I just want to quickly talk about some other cards that I think could be interesting. I've talked about how maybe you could run more copies of the 17th Infantry, but I do think there's some others. It could be maybe interesting to try the 5th Infantry Regiment, but this card has always just been like an okay card to me, and just isn't always the most effective, but we do have a very strong frontline presence, so maybe you could find a room for 1 or 2 of it. It buffs itself to a 3-4 if it gets in there, so could be effective maybe. The Hellcat could be somewhat effective if you wanted another non-frontline unit. It buffs itself when it fights, almost like the Survive Combat. Only when it attacks though, so it's a bit different, but could maybe be useful. Patrol is another card. This is a tech card, I would say, but if you are facing a lot of like Soviet value decks, I think Patrol as a copy or 2 could be really useful. They have a lot of strong destruction effects, they have a lot of guards, and this just is able to deal with them. Also useful at dealing with like artillery decks, so I think it's definitely a very worthwhile card if you're looking to deal with that. First Marines could be another option. Not the strongest body, but that blitz on a 3-4, you know, can apply decent pressure. Another card that could maybe fill up your 3-drop slot, because we are a bit lacking in our 3-drops. We got the Half-Track and the Hellcat, so maybe this is a good inclusion. Beyond that, where was it? If you wanted to meme, you could put the Chaffee in, because we do have a lot of front lines and we do have ways to buff it. So there is some fun meme potential, but I don't think it's definitely not a very strong card right now. So don't do it if you're not looking for fun. The M7 Priest is something I'm very interested in because I find a lot of the times I'm actually spending turn 1 and turn 2 just getting and fighting for the front line. And I actually want to try out the M7 Priest because if you can reliably get a 3/3 artillery for on turn 3, it could be a good way to apply more pressure, especially nasty and following into an island hopping, you know. The 3/3 Priest turns on the island hopping, which then buffs the Priest, and it could become a nasty cycle. So I'm going to probably try that out, but we haven't seen the Priest work before, so it might not work out. Beyond that, the P40 N5 is never a bad option. Kind of more of an anti-tech or an anti-aggro card because it just makes it so hard for the enemy to use and operate their units. Not bad. I just ran out of room for it, but I could definitely see, you know, like justification for getting it into the deck. Mobilization could also be a good option. If you're feeling like you're not having enough late game power, then mobilization could help you give extra draw. You may want to cut a Sherman or two for it, though. The Privateer is also something. It doesn't really fight for the front line very well, but it's very hard to interact with, and has so far just been a really good mid-game threat, so maybe there's something there with the Privateer that you could put into this deck. I would not run the Allegiance in the deck. We don't have enough British or Polish units to make that work. And beyond that, there's not much I'd want. Seaborne Invasion is probably the last card, but currently it's so RNG and can be so random that it doesn't work out. And as such, if Seaborne is ever buffed, I will honestly start running it. If they ever get rid of the RNG or just make it so it can't pull like 2 1/1s out. And I think Seaborne Invasion could be quite powerful as a late game last ditch effort to retake the front line, because that's what it did before, and it just has been kind of nerfed into the ground. So if we see this in a buff in the future, I'd probably make room for it. But beyond that, that is the deck list for today. I want to thank everybody so much for watching. Let me know, have you tried out any decks like this? Maybe in the US, maybe in another nation. If you have, maybe leave your deck list down in the comments below. You know, I've been really enjoying the Survive Combat, and I'd be curious if anybody's found any decks that have worked that aren't US based. Beyond that, I want to thank everybody so much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.